The Roman army dominated the Mediterranean for centuries. Yet, while the foot-based legions of the empire are most well known, they would gradually evolve over the years, eventually being replaced by a cavalry-centric army, which is woefully underappreciated. After all, it was this force which had been honed for centuries against the most dangerous foes of the era, and which would ultimately preserve the glory of Rome well into the Middle Ages. So today, let us explore its army composition from the parade ground to its marching camps, to their march in the fields, the battlefield, and beyond. This is the true size of the Byzantine army of the Thematic Reforms.
You can get your hands on your own late Roman army with today's sponsor, Victrix. They're an awesome company which creates historically accurate miniatures spanning all the way from the Greco-Persian Wars to the Napoleonic era and World War II. The figures are fantastically detailed 28mm models, perfect for wargaming or dioramas. The folks at Victrix are obsessed with history, which is why many of them actually watch our videos, and truly stand out when it comes to their accuracy and attention to detail. Kits come as plastic sets with tons of options to truly customize your build, and there's an excellent array of shield transfers to really make your soldiers unique. What I really appreciate is that Victrix is alive and thriving, and they're always coming up with new models and designs. The Roman range, for instance, just got a new bolt thrower. The late Romans now have armored infantry and cataphracts, and there's even more on the horizon for medieval units, which I'm stoked for. But best of all is we have a close relationship with the folks at Victrix, which allows us to offer 20% off the full range of products which are available on our page. So that includes Imperial Romans, Late Romans, and the Normans versus the Saxons. So definitely check it out and start building your own historical army by clicking the link in the description, and be sure to use our page for maximum savings. Enjoy!
By the late 10th century, the Roman army had changed dramatically. The plodding square of heavy infantry that conquered the Mediterranean was a half-forgotten memory when Leo VI sat down to write the Tactica that bears his name. The introduction of the stirrup to the Roman world in the 6th century had drastic effects on the foundations of the Roman army, which caused the cavalryman to firmly supplant the legionary as the tactical default. Another series of changes rocked the Romans after the death of the Prophet Muhammad and the explosive growth of the Rashidun Caliphate in the early 7th century. The Romans themselves had been supplanted by a new empire, and reform was needed for the state that we now know as Byzantium to survive. Enter the Thematic Reforms. This series of reforms, instituted in the 7th century and standardized in the 8th century, removed the standing regimented army of the late empire and replaced it with a sedentary levy-based army that would endure in some form until the late 11th century. Let us briefly review how it worked. At the core of this new levy system would be the administrative regions of the Byzantine Empire, known as themes. For our purposes, a theme can broadly be understood as the amount of land required to supply a predetermined amount of soldiers for the army. How much land and how many soldiers varied from theme to theme and was subject to changes over time. In most cases, though, the land within each theme was granted directly to prospective soldiers. During the reign of Constantine VII, infantrymen were given land worth at least £2 of gold, and cavalrymen were given land worth at least £4 of gold. In return for accepting these grants, soldiers took an oath of military service, or strateia. This obligation passed from father to son, or to whoever held the land. The average Byzantine soldier, therefore, was a free farmer who owed public tax to the realm and service to the emperor. In this way could the empire extract manpower from its realms. Yet this would rarely be done all at once, for fear of depleting the land of its farmers. Instead, the themes were organized into 4 large groups. A system of rotation then saw each group in turn serve for a year as the realm's standing army. Soldiers within such a force were a diverse group. Broadly speaking, they included the skirmishers, siloi, infantrymen, scutatoi, archers, toxotai, cavalrymen, cavallariai, and super-heavy cavalrymen, cataphractoi. In terms of pay, infantrymen received about 1 gold nomismata a month when levied, but were otherwise uncompensated for the remaining 3 years of the 4-year rotation cycle. By contrast, elite tagmatic troops in Constantinople, such as the hikanatoi, or able ones, were paid significantly more. This amounted to around 40 gold nomismata a month, with regular bonuses of silver and silks. In terms of equipment, a soldier's gear came from 3 sources. The first source was the collection of royally maintained warehouses where a man could purchase all the material he needed or could afford. The second source was the gear provided to the thematic armies by wealthy landowners who owed the empire a strateia but did not want to serve. The third source of equipment was from wealthy officers who were obliged to provide the remaining gear that their soldiers lacked. Having covered the basic foundation of the army, we can now build it up. But before we begin, it will be important to note that in this era, the cavalry seemed to have been the focus. Indeed, the ranks in Leo VI's Tactica refer to them exclusively. We shall therefore present these riders as the standard templates for our organizational model, even if they were not the most numerous overall in thematic armies. With this in mind, let us proceed. When the thematic army was mustered, the men were divided into squads, or Kontoveriai. Due to the militia nature of the army, these squads could be of any size. Leo VI advises that Kontoveriai be groups of 4, 5, 8, 10, or 16 men. For our model, the Kontoverion will be represented as 10 men, which may be called a decadarchy. These troopers were commanded by a decadarch, who was assisted by a pentarch and a tetrarch. These picked men were more heavily armoured than their troops, and each of these men could be identified by a coloured sash. The cavalry Kontoverion was made up of 6 lancers and 4 archers, with all of the officers acting as lancers. In battle, the cavalrymen were organised into files that were ideally 10 men deep. The decadarch led the men into battle and always rode in the front rank. The pentarch was positioned in the middle with the least combat-capable men, while the tetrarch took up the rear and kept the squad in formation. Leo advises that these men be placed in squads based on kinship and friendship, with a good mix of old and young men. It was very likely, for example, that your decadarch was also your uncle. In camp, the men slept in 2 pavilion-style tents with their gear stacked around the central pole and their bedrolls laid around the perimeter. In theory, each squad was meant to have 1 to 2 dedicated servants, but this was rarely the case. Therefore, Leo VI advises that the poorest member of the squad act as a servant. This man drove the squad's supply wagon. There was also 1 pack animal for every 2 squads. Typically, these were kept in groups of 3 or 4 and were led by 1 man. Therefore, for each Kontoveriai, we will also assume that our fighting force is accompanied by 1 shared mule, 1 wagon, 10 spare horses, and 2 tents. At the next organizational level, 5 Kontoveriai were grouped together into a group of 50, known as an Allaghion, or Little Wing, under the command of a Pentakontakes, or Lord of 50. 2 Allaghia were then grouped together into a Kentakion of 100 men, commanded by Kentarion, or a Hekatontakes, depending on the source. This organizational unit was a direct descendant of the Roman century. In terms of support, each Kentakion brought with it about 5 mules, 10 wagons, 100 spare horses, and 20 tents. Added to this will be an extra tent and a pair of servants, assuming we grant the Kentarian more support on account of his rank and social status. Next up, several of the Kentakion units would come together to form the Vanda. The size could vary, but it generally represented what we would think of today as a county or parish and stood anywhere from 200 to 400 men strong. Some regions were not able to provide enough armed men to form a Vanda, and so they were grouped together with other regions until the unit had reached sufficient size. The Vanda was commanded by a Komes, or count, who likely acted as a civil administrator when he wasn't called to war. The Komes was assisted by the senior Kentarion, who was known as the Iliarches. The Komes was also assisted by 2 heralds or mandatores, 2 bannermen or vandafori, and 1 trumpeter or vukinator. Using our prior figures and tacking on a few extras, a 200-man Vanda would be accompanied by roughly 10 servants, 10 mules, 20 wagons, 200 spare horses, and 43 tents. In addition, the Vanda brought with it a collection of artisans including smiths, fletchers, and bowyers, all likely raised from the same region that the Vanda itself came from. For our purposes, we will assume they number about 10 men. We should also note that 1 dekaki in each Vanda was given the role of medics or medical deputies. In battle, they spent their time ferrying the wounded back to the camp surgeons. Such men were paid 1 gold nomisma for each noble rider that they rescued. But before continuing to advance through the ranks of the cavalry, let us catch up on the infantry and archers. As previously stated, we have assumed that they were roughly organized in a similar manner. To recap quickly, you first had the dekaki of 10 men along with its support elements. This was followed by the Kentakion of 100 and then the Vanda of about 200 to 400 men. However, one important point to make is that the Byzantines were generally short on archers. For smaller armies, this meant fielding 2 infantry Vanda for each 1 archery Vanda. Only the larger armies proved capable of maintaining a more equivalent ratio. But regardless of their size, these archers were all grouped under the command of the Architoxeter, or Lord of the Archers. Moving now to the higher ranks, we shall return to our cavalry formations. At the next level up, 5 cavalry Vanda joined together to form a 1,000-man unit known as the Droungos, which was commanded by Droungarios. This was a purely tactical unit that had no attached civil administration. Rather, the civil administration was instead attached to an equivalent unit of infantry or archers known as the Moira, which was commanded by a Moirarch. When not raised for war, the Moirarch likely oversaw a fortress or 2 in his home region. Each fighting force of Droungos was supported by about 50 servants, 50 mules, 100 wagons, 1,000 spare horses, and 216 tents, in addition to roughly 50 artisans. Each infantry or archer Moira had a similar setup minus the spare horses. Next, 3 Droungarioi came together to form a roughly 3,000-man Tourma, commanded by a Tourmarch. Within the Thematic Army, the senior or most powerful Tourmarch served as the second to the strategos or general, and was known as the Meriarch. The Meriarch typically commanded the center of the Byzantine battle line and stood ready to step in for the strategos should he fail in his duty. Outside of the army, Tourmarchs often served as the military administrators for fortified towns or large fortress complexes along the borders. These forts and towns acted as the headquarters for the Tourma, serving both as its base of supply and also as a barracks for the professional soldiers that formed the core of the Thematic Army. The Tourmarch was likely responsible for not just his own fortress complex or town, but for the entire region's fortress chain. Fully mustered, a mounted Tourma of 3,000 riders was accompanied by about 150 servants, 150 mules, 300 wagons, 3,000 horse spares, 649 tents, and 150 artisans. Once more, the archer and infantry Tourma were similarly equipped with the exception of the horse spares. Yet while the Tourma were important building blocks of the army, some Tourmarchs existed completely independently, answering only to the emperor himself. These Tourmarchs governed the critical passes that lead in and out of the Byzantine Empire, such as the Cilician Gates in the Taurus Mountains, or the passes at Seleucia and Chersonese. These passes were designated as kleisoi, and their commanders were the kleisarchi. Other unique Tourma included the truly ancient units that could trace their lineage back to the 4th or 5th century, like the Theodosiaci and the Victoras in Thrace, which were both units formed during the late antique period of the Roman Empire, nearly 5 centuries before Leo the Wise wrote the Tactica, which we are using as our guide. Most units in the Byzantine world could not claim this distinction, as by the 10th century the Byzantine army had been reformed and reorganized so many times that most units had forgotten any lineage they might have had. Moving yet further up the ranks, 3 Tourma came together to form a theme of 9,000 men. While some themes may have been dedicated to raising cavalry, most fielded a mix of forces. We have therefore chosen to represent our thematic units as a mixed force featuring 1 Tourma of cavalry, 1 of infantry, and 1 of archers. All such forces were commanded by a strategos. He would be accompanied by several subordinate officials from his region. These included the domestic of the theme, the chief judge, or praetor, the senior secretary, or protonotary, and the army inspector, or chartularius. Based on our prior accounting, the theme will have 460 servants, 450 mules, 900 wagons, 3,000 horse spares, 1,950 tents, and 450 artisans. In addition to this, we shall assume that the theme brings with it 50 additional specialists who will act as engineers, doctors, scribes, and miscellaneous support. While such a force was quite impressive on its own, it would often be further reinforced by elite troops from Constantinople. These standing units included super-heavy cataphracts, veteran swordsmen, and other mercenary soldiers, which may have been raised for the campaign season. For our purposes, we have assumed that the capital has sent our thematic commander, the Hekanati, a unit of 450 tagmatic cataphracts commanded by a domestikos. Laid out at parade rest, our thematic army is a mighty force, which would certainly make its ancient Roman forebearers proud. However, there are some important points of distinction to raise when we review the analytics. At a high level, we see that an early Imperial Legion's population was roughly 80% human and 20% animal. Byzantine armies, in comparison, were 60% human and 40% animal. This trend is further reinforced when we look at the actual troop type ratios. Here, we see that the Imperial Legion had only about 2% of its men acting as mounted troops. By contrast, our Byzantine force boasts almost 30% mounted riders, a quite stark differential. While the earlier Romans would have narrowed this gap through outsourcing to auxiliaries and allies, it is a significant point of distinction that Byzantine armies explicitly made such cavalry forces a core part of their armies. According to our model, The data suggests that the Byzantines enjoyed a higher officer ratio and a lower support ratio than their legionary counterparts. But what impacts this had on the performance of either army is subject to debate. Moving on, we can now seek to represent our army in more realistic scenarios, including its camp, march, and battle stances. When on campaign, the Byzantines followed the traditions of their ancestors through the construction of well-organized marching camps. As in days past, these featured large rectangular layouts with intersecting main roads which led out to 4 gates. A legionary of the imperial era would have little difficulty finding his way around. However, there were a few differences to note. First off, while the perimeter wall may have been constructed of palisades, the Byzantines sometimes employed a wagon wall, or karagos, which would have been set just behind the ditch and earthen rampart. For even greater protection, they might spread caltrops and spikes around the approaches to the camp. Another difference was the distribution of its men within the layout. In these matters, the Byzantines placed the cavalry and baggage in the centre, with the infantry camped around them, and the light infantry and archers located nearest the wall. As for the officers, the general slept somewhere along the main road, foregoing the traditional central intersection, but nonetheless requiring all units to post a messenger nearby to ensure he remained at the centre of the army's command and control. Meanwhile, the Tourma slept in the centre of their units, where they were best protected and best able to take command in an emergency situation. And finally, each of the 4 exits was controlled by a Count of the Gates. This man and his Vanda camped near the gates and acted as the gate guards. At night, the gates were sealed, and only the nightly cavalry patrols were allowed to exit camp. When morning came, it would be time to march out. Once more, the Byzantines maintained a practice of neat organisation. Light infantry and cavalry scouted ahead of the column in the Roman fashion. They were joined by the minsoures, who checked the roads and scouted for good camping sites. Behind them came the vanguard, the main body, the baggage train, and the rear guard. Zooming into the main body, we see the general riding at the head of the column. He is joined by his coterie of officers and a picked Vanda to act as his bodyguard. His personal baggage train rides close behind. On their heels come the marching columns of infantry and cavalry, each headed by their respective Tourmakoi. Depending on road conditions, this nearly 10,000 strong force can stretch out over 3 to 5 kilometers. To ease logistics, they may actually disperse along smaller roads, or alternatively may advance in squares for better protection. Behind the main body comes the lumbering baggage train, composed of horse spares, mules, ox-pulled wagons, servants, and the families of the marching soldiers. It too will stretch out over several kilometers. To bring order to this caravan, the baggage will be organised by each wing of the army, starting with the right wing in the lead, followed by the centre, and finally the left. Within each wing, the baggage was further organised by Vanda and led by its respective Vanda Foros. The commander of the entire baggage train brought up the rear to keep everyone in line, while his lieutenant rode at the front in a specially marked wagon. And finally, behind this entire force came the designated units of the rear guard, which were likely composed of light troops and cavalry. In this way would a 6 to 10 kilometer army snake its way across the countryside towards its objective. Apparently, however, if the army came to a perilous piece of terrain, such as a river crossing, the general was advised to pull himself out of the column and oversee the crossing. Leo VI provides the following anecdote as an example. We recall that our ever-memorable father and Emperor Vasil did this when he was on campaign against Germanica in Syria. He arrived at the river called Paradisos and stationed himself in the middle of it with lamps, and in his presence the entire army, under his command, made the crossing easily and securely. He frequently gave a hand and, by himself, saved several soldiers from great danger. However, if the enemy was judged to be close, then the task fell instead to the Tourmakoi. Each Tourmak saw his men across the river before passing the baton on to the Tourmak behind him. Eventually, this army would reach its foe and deploy for battle. As in days past, there were many ways a commander might choose to array his forces. For now, we will present what appears to have been one of the more standard formations. This consisted of a double infantry line flanked by cavalry wings. The front line was technically divided into 3 sections. However, given its role as the main fighting line, its units would be deployed in tight order, presenting a single, unbreakable wall to the enemy. Within this formation, the front ranks consisted of the heavy infantry, while archers and skirmishers lurked behind. Here, each unit's bannermen proudly rallied the soldiers around their flags, while officers exhorted their men. The Tactica recommends that such morale-boosting speeches include reminders of the rewards of God, the Emperor, and the lives of their families. While the front ranks steeled themselves for battle, the second line meanwhile acted as the reserves. Its forces were grouped into 2 wings, with units spaced out by the length of a bowshot, or roughly 250 meters. Such spacing greatly improved their mobility, allowing reserves to be rapidly brought up in battle to respond to emergency situations, such as shoring up gaps in the defense or lending weight to attacks. On the flanks, the units of heavy cavalry and cataphracts were placed just a few hundred meters offset from the main battle line. The more vulnerable tips of the wings, meanwhile, were guarded by several Vanda of horse archers. Even further beyond, the Byzantines reportedly placed spies, or skulks, to keep an eye out for enemy trickery. As for the battle itself, commanders tended to use the center to fix the enemy in place. While this may have been accomplished with a stationary line reinforced by earthworks, a charge could also be warranted. Here, the men would break from complete silence to shout the Christian war cry of Stavros Nika, while trumpets sounded across the deep. Yet, while such a fixing maneuver was important, victory itself was often achieved by the cavalry, who then rushed in from the flanks to envelop their foe, hammering them into dust against the anvil of Byzantium's front lines. There will be much more to discuss when it comes to the military of the Byzantine army, but we hope that this look at the true size of their forces has helped provide you with important insights on the matter.
Quick reminder here at the end of the video to check out Victrix miniatures and their awesome figurines, which cover everything from antiquity to the Middle Ages, the Napoleonics, and World War II. So check them out. They're huge fans of the channel, and as such, they're offering you guys 20% off if you buy any of the products linked on our page specifically, but you have to use our link in the description. So enjoy, and happy painting.
You can get HD downloads of all our art by heading over to our Patreon or becoming a channel member. A huge thanks to our current supporters for funding the channel, and a shout out to the researchers, writers, and artists who made this episode possible. We couldn't have done it without this team and this community. If you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe for more content and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.